After the Civil War and before World War I, dual federalism with sometimes modifications existed. But after World War I, particularly during the Great Depression, it became increasingly evident that the national government was going to find cures for problems at the national level. And so dual federalism, layer cake federalism, was the victim. What you have is the advent of what was called marble cake federalism. There was no clear, distinct lines between what the federal government could do and what the states could do. And part of this was the advent of what were called grants and aid, whereby the federal government would grant aid to the states and manage to share some of the revenues that were generated by the national government. This, began before the Constitution, even with what were called land grant colleges, whereby the national government was giving various cash grants to the states, but it dramatically increased in scope in the 20th century. These grants and aid and marble cake federalism was attractive for a number of reasons. Federal budget surpluses in the 19th century after the Civil War, federal income tax after the 16th Amendment gave more money to the national government that could be distributed to the states, federal controlled supply of money, and the Federal Reserve System allowed what was called free money that was available to state officials, but it also required a broad congressional coalitions. So meeting national needs continued through World War II. By 1960s, you had a shift in grants and aids from what the states demanded to what the federal officials found important as national needs. It was a means by which, quite frankly, the national government could decide what it wanted to do and thereby stick a carrot out there for the states by which they could get money from the federal government to implement national goals. As a result, you have hundreds of state and local officials that are lobbying in Washington for more money with fewer strings attached to those grants and aid. What were called categorical grants versus revenue sharing. Revenue sharing was just simply sharing the national government's riches, whereas categorical grants are for specific purposes that often require local matching funds to show that local governments and state governments were serious in implementing some national policies. Categorical grants could include, for example, for increasing police force, if by national government standards there were more minorities hired or more women hired for the police forces. Block grants were devoted to general purposes with few restrictions, but as we can see, block grants went the way of the dinosaur because the federal government prefers categorical grants to implement its policies. Revenue sharing requires no matching funds and provides freedom in how to spend. Basically ended in 1986 as the federal government had more and more budget deficits. They simply didn't have enough money to distribute. Neither block grants nor revenue sharing achieved the goal of giving the states more freedom in spending. The states have had less freedom in how they can spend money given to them by the federal government. So you had a slowdown in free money. The block grants grew more slowly. There was no single interest group that had a vital stake in multi-purpose block grants, no single interest group that had an interest in revenue sharing. Categorical grants became the norm, and they were matters of life or death for various agencies. Revenue sharing was wasteful, as it was ineffective and lacked accountability. And the Congress of the United States was not going to put up with a lack of accountability at the state and local level for the monies that it was providing. So as a result, you have rivalry among the states. Increased competition was a result of increased dependency on the federal government. The Snow Belt states versus the Sun Belt states. Who was going to get the most money? Difficulty of telling where the funds spent, and most importantly, the census took on some monumental significance. Since you had money being distributed by the federal government based upon where people were moving to. The census is very important and still remains very important. Mandates by the federal government are rules that states and localities must obey, whether they receive aid or not. If they intend to get any aid in the future, they have to go by those rules. Some of those rules can be anti-discrimination rules. You can think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, pollution control laws, and the Environmental Protection Agency has all kinds of monies available for states and localities, but they have to follow national guidelines. Safety and transportation. Think about how the states get money, for example, for interstate highway systems, but they have to go by the federal rules for seatbelt use and so forth. Oftentimes, as a result, you have administration and financial problems. You've had growth in mandates from 1981 to 1991. The impact of the mandates and the congressional response has been very simple. The National Congress says if the states want the money, then they have to go by national rules, and that doesn't set up for a very good relationship. The most controversial mandates result from court decisions. It's easier now for the national government to sue localities when they don't go by the rules when money is being distributed. Conditions of aid are oftentimes attached to grants of the states. When those states get money voluntarily, they have to go by the rules. Conditions can range from specific to general. As a rule, Democrats, when in power, like specific rules for national norms, while the Republicans may have general rules as conditions of aid. Divergent views of states and federal government on costs and benefits. The question always becomes, is it worth going through all the paperwork to take on federal government's conditions of aid for their grants? There have been failed presidential attempts to reverse the trend. Nixon tried new federalism in the late 60s and early 70s. Reagan in the 1980s attempted to consolidate categorical grants, making them more effective. But a Democratic Congress was very lukewarm to Reagan's attempt to consolidate categorical grants. The states have responded by experimenting with new ways of delivering services, for example, child care, welfare, education, using their own monies to try to solve their own problems. What you end up having today is what I term dysfunctional federalism. There's been a renewed effort to shift important functions of the states by the Republican-controlled Congress by 1994. Key issues have been welfare, the Aid for Dependent Children program. President Clinton signed a bill to turn back to the states control of welfare programs. What it all comes down to is that increasing budget deficits at the national level means that you have unfunded mandates at the state level where the national government is telling the states what to do, but they don't fund the programs.